She stood at the altar to save her starving family, pledging her life to a reclusive northern king. But as the castle doors locked and her new husband stepped into the moonlight, the horrifying truth dawned. The man sharing her bed was the beast that tore her childhood apart. The year was 1428, and the house of Ainsley was bleeding to death. In the southern territory of Oakhaven, the once proud Ainsley estate was a shadow of its former glory. Lady Beatrice Ainsley stood by the frost-covered windows of the great hall, watching as the bailiffs of Baron Cedric Harrington catalogued her family's remaining assets. They took the silver tapestries, the ancestral longswords, and even the prized destriers from the stables. Her father, Lord Reginald Ainsley, sat slumped by the dying hearth, a broken man clutching a cup of watered-down wine. He had gambled their fortune on failed shipping ventures in the Emerald Sea and borrowed heavily from Harrington, a ruthless creditor who now demanded full repayment or their land, their titles, and their lives. Beatrice was 20, with hair the color of autumn leaves and eyes sharpened by years of quiet suffering. She knew what Harrington truly wanted. He had made it abundantly clear that he would forgive the Ainsley debts if Beatrice were given to him as a concubine. It was a fate worse than death. Harrington was notorious for his cruelty, and Beatrice's mother, Lady Genevieve, wept daily at the prospect. Deliverance came not from a white knight, but from the frozen, brutal north. It arrived on a bleak Tuesday in the form of Lord Fenwick, an emissary wrapped in thick direwolf pelts. He carried the seal of King Alistair of Duncraig, the sovereign of the northern reaches. King Alistair was a man steeped in violent rumors. They called him the Wolf King, a sovereign who rarely showed his face at court, ruling his frozen domain with an iron fist. He was said to be cursed, a savage warrior who tore his enemies apart with his bare hands. Yet Lord Fenwick placed a heavy chest of gold ingots on the ruined oak table of the Ainsley Hall. "My king requires a queen," Fenwick announced, his voice echoing in the hollow room. "A woman of noble southern blood, to solidify the peace treaty signed 10 years ago. King Alistair offers this dowry. It is enough to pay Baron Harrington 3 times over and restore your lands. In exchange, Lady Beatrice travels north with me at first light. She will belong to Duncraig." Lord Reginald was paralyzed by the gold, but it was Beatrice who stepped forward. She looked at her father's trembling hands, heard her younger sister weeping in the corridor, and knew there was no choice. To stay meant ruin and Harrington's bed. To go meant a lifetime in the ice with a warlord. "Tell your king I accept," Beatrice said, her voice steady despite the ice forming in her veins. The journey north took 3 grueling weeks. As the carriage rumbled past the border of Oakhaven and into the jagged, snow-choked mountains of the northern reaches, the landscape grew hostile. The trees here were twisted, ancient things that seemed to claw at the grey sky. Beatrice sat wrapped in furs, clutching a small silver hunting knife hidden in her skirts. It was a family heirloom, and the only piece of her home she had managed to smuggle away. When they finally reached the fortress of Duncraig, Beatrice was struck by its imposing, brutal architecture. Carved directly into the side of a black mountain, the castle loomed like a dormant beast. The banners of House Duncraig, a black wolf on a field of crimson, snapped violently in the freezing wind. She met King Alistair that very evening in the Great Hall. He was not the grotesque monster the southern bards sang of, but his presence was suffocatingly intense. Alistair was a towering figure, broad-shouldered and lean, dressed in dark leathers and heavy furs. His hair was black as a raven's wing, and a neatly trimmed beard framed a sharp, aristocratic jaw. But it was his eyes that stole the breath from Beatrice's lungs. They were a piercing, unnatural shade of amber, luminous and predatory. He did not smile when she bowed. He simply studied her, his gaze lingering on the pulse at her throat before meeting her eyes. "You are shivering, Lady Beatrice," Alistair said. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone that sent a strange vibration through the stone floor. "The north is colder than I am accustomed to, Your Grace," she replied, keeping her chin high. "You will adapt," he said plainly. "We wed tomorrow at dusk. The north does not care for long engagements, nor do I." He turned and left her standing there, the heavy oak doors slamming shut behind him. Beatrice was left alone in the drafty hall, a pawn traded for gold, terrified of the amber-eyed king and the shadows that seemed to cling to him like a second cloak. She told herself she could survive his coldness. She had survived worse. But as she lay in her new, unfamiliar bed that night, the howl of a wolf echoed from the mountains, a lonely, bone-chilling sound that dragged Beatrice violently back into her darkest nightmares. The marriage ceremony was as bleak as the northern landscape. Standing in the castle's open-air courtyard under a twilight sky, Beatrice wore a heavy gown of midnight blue. Alistair stood beside her, radiating a strange, feverish heat despite the freezing snow drifting around them. When the high priest bound their hands with a silken cord, Alistair's skin touched hers. It was unnaturally hot, calloused, and rough. "With this blood, the pack is bound," the priest chanted, cutting a shallow line across both their palms and pressing them together. Beatrice flinched, but Alistair held her hand firmly. For a brief second, she looked up and caught him staring down at her. The predatory edge in his amber eyes was softened by something she couldn't quite decipher. Sorrow, perhaps, or regret. The first month of her reign as Queen of Duncraig was isolating, but not entirely cruel. To her surprise, Alistair was not a tyrant to her. He was meticulously polite, ensuring her chambers were always warmed, her wardrobe filled with the finest northern furs, and her letters to her family securely dispatched. Yet he was a ghost. They shared meals in agonizing silence, and he never once came to her bedchamber. He slept in the eastern wing, a heavily guarded section of the fortress where no servants were allowed. But Duncraig held secrets, and the nights were the hardest for Beatrice. Every time the moon grew full, the castle was locked down. The heavy iron gates were barred, and the servants retreated to the lower levels, locking their doors. A strict curfew was enforced. Lord Fenwick had warned her vaguely. "The king hunts on the full moon, my queen. The woods are treacherous. Do not leave your rooms." The howling would start shortly after midnight. It was a sound that made Beatrice's blood run cold, triggering the deeply buried trauma she had fought for over a decade to repress. 1416, the summer estate near the Whispering Woods. Beatrice was 8 years old. Her older brother, Arthur, was 14. They had been playing in the gardens at dusk when the screams started. The memory was a fractured mosaic of terror. The splintering of heavy oak doors, the scent of wet fur and copper blood, and the colossal shadowy beast that burst into the manor. It was a wolf, but impossibly large, walking on 2 legs before dropping to all 4s. Arthur had shoved Beatrice into a hollowed-out hearth, hiding her in the ash. He had stood his ground with the very silver hunting knife Beatrice now kept under her pillow. She watched through a crack in the stones as the monster lunged. Arthur fought bravely. He managed to drive the silver blade upward, slashing the beast violently across its left eye. The monster roared, a sound that still echoed in Beatrice's nightmares, and struck Arthur down. The beast had paused, its ruined, bleeding left eye locking onto the hearth where Beatrice hid. Its remaining eye was a glowing, demonic yellow. Then, hearing the shouts of the approaching guards, the monster had fled into the night, leaving Beatrice an only child in a puddle of her brother's blood. For 12 years, the face of that beast, with its freshly severed left eye, had haunted her every waking moment. Now, trapped in the freezing halls of Duncraig, the howling outside her window sounded identical to the roar that had shattered her childhood. On the night of the 3rd full moon since her arrival, Beatrice could bear the ignorance no longer. The howling was closer tonight, not in the mountains, but within the castle walls. Specifically, from the courtyard near the eastern wing. Armed with her brother's silver hunting knife, Beatrice slipped out of her chambers. The stone corridors were pitch black and eerily silent. Her soft slippers made no sound as she crept down the spiral staircase, driven by a mixture of terrifying dread and desperate curiosity. She had to know what her husband was hiding. She reached the iron-wrought balcony that overlooked the enclosed private courtyard of the eastern wing. The moon hung bloated and white in the sky, illuminating the snow-covered grounds below. Down in the courtyard, King Alistair was alone. He was stripped to the waist, kneeling in the snow. Beatrice gasped, pressing herself against the cold stone pillar. Alistair was trembling violently. The bones in his back shifted and cracked with a sickening, wet crunch. He threw his head back, letting out an agonizing scream that seamlessly morphed into a guttural, terrifying howl. Dark, coarse fur erupted across his skin, his limbs elongated, his spine snapping into a hunched, monstrous posture. Beatrice clapped a hand over her mouth, tears of absolute horror stinging her eyes. A werewolf. The ancient northern legends were not myths, they were history. Her husband was a monster. But the sheer terror of the transformation paled in comparison to what she saw next. The beast shook its massive head, panting heavily, its breath pluming in the freezing air. It turned its massive skull toward the balcony, sensing her presence. The moonlight fell perfectly across its monstrous face. The wolf was pitch black, standing as tall as a warhorse. Its right eye burned with a familiar, luminous amber. But across its left eye was a horrific, jagged scar, a thick band of twisted white tissue where the fur refused to grow, completely blinding the eye. A scar perfectly consistent with the desperate upward slash of a 14-year-old boy wielding a silver hunting knife. Beatrice's heart stopped. The silver knife slipped from her trembling, numb fingers, clattering loudly against the stone balcony. The beast's amber eye locked onto her. It wasn't just a werewolf. It was the werewolf. The King of Duncraig, her husband, the man she had bound her blood to, was the very monster that had slaughtered her brother. The silver hunting knife clattered against the stone floor, the sound shattering the frozen silence of the courtyard. The colossal black beast flinched, its massive head snapping upward. The amber eye locked onto Beatrice, glowing with a terrifying, ancient intelligence. She could not move. Her lungs refused to draw breath. The jagged, ruined tissue across its left eye was a grotesque mirror to the horror of her childhood. It was him, the murderer, the monster. The beast did not snarl. It did not lunge. Instead, a low, wretched whine vibrated from its throat, a sound so deeply human and filled with agonizing sorrow that it sent a fresh tremor of shock through Beatrice's core. For a fleeting second, the monster seemed to bow its massive head toward her, as if acknowledging a profound, unspoken guilt. Then, with a powerful thrust of its hind legs, the werewolf vaulted over the iron-wrought gates and vanished into the unforgiving northern blizzard, leaving Beatrice alone in the suffocating dark. She did not sleep that night. She barricaded herself inside her bedchamber, dragging a heavy oak dresser in front of the door. She sat on the floor, clutching her knees to her chest, her mind a spiraling vortex of grief and absolute rage. The man who had gently ensured her comfort, the king who had paid her family's debts, was the beast that had torn her brother Arthur to pieces. He had bought her. He had brought his victim's sister into his very home, perhaps as a sick trophy, or perhaps to finally finish the bloodline he had started destroying 12 years ago. When dawn finally broke, painting the snow-capped mountains of Duncraig in shades of pale rose and brutal grey, Beatrice's terror had hardened into cold, crystalline vengeance. She retrieved the silver hunting knife from where she had abandoned it on the balcony. Her brother's dried blood was still embedded deep within the intricate leather of the hilt. She slipped the blade into the sleeve of her velvet gown. She would not be a victim. She would not be a pawn. She would be the executioner of Duncraig. King Alistair was in his private study when she found him. The heavy oak doors were unguarded. The room smelled of old parchment, burning pine, and the faint metallic tang of blood. Alistair stood by the arched window, his broad back turned to her. He was fully clothed in his usual dark leathers, but his posture was unnaturally rigid. "You should not have left your chambers last night, Beatrice," Alistair said softly, not turning around. His voice was hoarse, stripped of its usual commanding resonance. Beatrice did not hesitate. She crossed the room in 3 swift, silent strides, drawing the silver blade from her sleeve. She lunged, aiming directly for his spine. Alistair's reflexes were impossibly fast. He spun around, catching her wrist in an iron grip before the blade could pierce his heavy tunic. The silver was mere inches from his chest. Beatrice screamed in sheer frustration, throwing her entire body weight against him, fighting like a wildcat. She kicked, she clawed, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. "Murderer!" she shrieked, her voice echoing off the stone walls. "You killed him! You slaughtered Arthur! Let me kill you! Let me end this curse!" Alistair did not fight back. He simply held her wrists firmly, absorbing her blows, his face an unreadable mask of stoic torment. Slowly, deliberately, he released his grip on her right hand, the hand holding the knife. He reached out and wrapped his large, calloused fingers around her trembling ones, guiding the tip of the silver blade until it rested directly over his own racing heart. "If my death will bring your soul peace, Beatrice, then strike," Alistair whispered, his amber eyes burning with a haunting sincerity. "Press the silver in. I will not stop you." Beatrice froze. Her hands were shaking violently. The blade pricked his leather tunic. She looked up into his face. In the harsh morning light, she finally noticed the faint, pale line running vertically over his left eyelid, a subtle human echo of the horrific scar that mutilated his beast form. "Why?" she sobbed, her strength suddenly failing her. "Why did you come to my home? Why did you kill my brother?" "Because I was a slave," Alistair answered, his voice thick with a grief that spanned over a decade. He gently took the knife from her loosened grip and tossed it onto the heavy oak desk. "Sit down, Beatrice. It is time you knew the dark truth of Oakhaven, and the blood that stains both our families." Beatrice collapsed into a leather chair by the hearth, her body trembling uncontrollably as Alistair began to speak, unearthing secrets that had been buried in blood for 12 years. In the year 1415, Alistair began, pacing the floor like a caged predator. Your father, Lord Reginald Ainsley, sought to multiply your family's fortune. He poured the entirety of your family's wealth into supporting King Henry V's legendary campaign in France, banking on the spoils of the Battle of Agincourt. But your father was swindled by his own financial backers, chief among them being Baron Cedric Harrington's father, Lord Silas Harrington. The Harringtons did not just trade in coin, Beatrice. They traded in ancient, forbidden occultism. They practiced blood magic, a blasphemous art imported from the darkest corners of the Eastern world. Beatrice listened in stunned silence. She knew Harrington was a ruthless creditor, a cruel man who thrived on the misery of others. But occultism? I was 19 years old, Alistair continued, turning to look out the frosted window. I had foolishly travelled south to negotiate a trade route. My carriage was ambushed by Harrington's mercenaries. They did not want ransom. They wanted a weapon. They dragged me to the dungeons beneath Harrington Manor. It was there that Lord Harrington infected me with the lycanthropy curse, binding me with a dark runic collar forged of cursed silver and human bone. He tortured me, breaking my mind and binding my will to his command. Whenever the moon was full, I was unleashed upon his political enemies. I was a prisoner in my own mind, trapped inside the body of a slaughtering beast. Alistair closed his eyes, a solitary tear escaping and tracking down his scarred cheek. On that summer night in 1416, Harrington ordered me to massacre the Ainsley family. He wanted your father's lands, and a massacre by a wild beast would leave no legal heirs and no suspicion of murder. The collar forced me to shift. It drove me to your estate. I smashed through the doors. I was a passenger in my own body, screaming for the monster to stop as it prowled through your halls. Beatrice let out a small, broken gasp, the memory of that horrifying night rushing back with violent clarity. Then your brother stood before me, Alistair said softly. Arthur. He was so young, so impossibly brave. He held that silver hunting knife. When he struck me, when he drove that silver blade into my eye, the agony was indescribable. But the holy purity of the silver disrupted the dark magic of the runic collar. Arthur's strike broke Harrington's control over my mind. Alistair turned to face her fully, his expression a portrait of sheer devastation. I regained control of the beast for just a fraction of a second, long enough to violently throw myself backward, away from Arthur. But my massive weight caused the ceiling beams to collapse. The stone hearth crumbled. I did not strike your brother down, Beatrice. The falling masonry did. I dragged myself out of the wreckage, blinded and bleeding, terrified that if I stayed, the collar's magic might reassert itself and force me to finish the slaughter. I fled into the night, eventually making my way back to the northern reaches, but the guilt of Arthur's death never left me. The silence in the study was absolute, save for the crackle of the hearth. Beatrice stared at her husband, the man she had believed to be a remorseless monster. The pieces of the puzzle aggressively slammed into place. Harrington's absolute dominance over her father, the mysterious loss of the Ainsley fortune, the relentless, crushing debt that had almost forced her into Harrington's bed. You paid my father's debts, Beatrice whispered, the realization dawning upon her like the breaking of a storm. The gold you brought. You were buying my freedom from Harrington. I have spent the last 12 years secretly trying to protect your family, Alistair confessed. I sent anonymous funds, deterred Harrington's men from your borders when I could. But when Baron Cedric Harrington took his father's place, his cruelty escalated. When my spies informed me that he intended to claim you as payment, I could no longer remain in the shadows. I sent Lord Fenwick with the king's ransom to legally sever Harrington's claim over you. I brought you to Duncraig because it is the only fortress in the realm strong enough to withstand Harrington's dark influence. Beatrice stood up, her legs unsteady, but her mind suddenly clear. The hatred that had consumed her for a decade began to splinter, dissolving into a profound, overwhelming empathy for the broken king standing before her. They were both victims of the same monstrous lineage. Arthur had not died in vain. He had freed a king from enslavement. Before Beatrice could speak, a massive horn echoed through the frozen valleys of Duncraig. It was a deep, guttural blast that shook the very foundations of the castle. Lord Fenwick burst into the study, his face pale, his armor clanking. "Your Grace, we are under siege. An army marches upon the southern gates. They bear the banners of House Harrington." Alistair's expression hardened into a mask of pure, lethal fury. He strapped his broadsword to his hip. "Cedric Harrington! He knows the magical properties of my curse. He knows I am vulnerable today, weakened by the shift of the full moon. He has come to finish his father's work. He demands the Queen," Fenwick added grimly. "He claims the marriage is unlawful, backed by corrupt southern magistrates. He brings archers, sire, hundreds of them, and their arrows gleam with silver." "Hold the gates," Alistair commanded, his amber eyes flaring with an unnatural, terrifying light. "I will not let that parasite step foot within my walls. If he wants a monster, I will give him one." Alistair turned to Beatrice, his gaze softening for a fraction of a second. "Stay within the inner keep. Bar the doors. If I do not return, Fenwick has orders to smuggle you to the northern coast. You will be safe." He did not wait for her reply. Alistair stormed out of the study, leaving Beatrice standing by the hearth. She looked at the silver hunting knife resting on the heavy oak desk. She thought of her brother. She thought of the torment Alistair had endured for 12 years. She thought of the monstrous Baron Harrington, who had engineered every ounce of suffering in her life. Beatrice snatched the silver knife from the desk. She was done hiding. The courtyard was a theater of absolute chaos. Snow fell in thick, blinding sheets as the heavy iron gates of Duncraig strained under the assault of Harrington's battering rams. Flaming arrows streaked across the grey sky, hissing as they struck the frozen stone. Suddenly, the gates splintered open. Baron Cedric Harrington rode into the courtyard atop a massive, armoured destrier. He was clad in gilded armour, a cruel, arrogant smirk plastered across his face. Behind him poured dozens of heavily armed mercenaries, their crossbows loaded with deadly silver quarrels. "Alistair!" Harrington's voice boomed over the din of battle. "Come out, you mongrel dog! Return my property, or I will burn this frozen tomb to the ground and mount your wolf's head on a spike." From the shadows of the upper parapets, a deafening, blood-curdling roar answered him. Alistair did not emerge as a king. He descended as the beast. He vaulted down from the 40-foot wall, shifting in mid-air. The sickening crunch of expanding bones and tearing fabric echoed through the courtyard. By the time he hit the snow, the black wolf stood towering, its amber eye burning with the fury of 1,000 betrayed souls. The battle was swift and brutally violent. Alistair tore through the mercenaries with terrifying speed, his massive claws rending steel armor like parchment. He absorbed glancing blows, shrugging off standard steel swords. But Harrington had prepared. "Fire the silver!" Harrington screamed, pointing his gauntleted finger at the raging beast. A volley of silver-tipped arrows whistled through the air. Two of them struck true, burying themselves deep into Alistair's right shoulder and thigh. The werewolf let out an agonizing, deafening shriek, collapsing into the blood-stained snow. The holy metal seared his flesh, neutralizing his supernatural healing and draining his strength instantly. Harrington dismounted his horse, drawing a long, gleaming silver broadsword. He walked slowly toward the immobilized, panting wolf, his eyes filled with sadistic glee. "My father should have put you down permanently when he had the chance," Harrington sneered, raising the heavy silver sword high above his head to deliver the killing blow to Alistair's exposed neck. "Harrington!" The scream tore through the freezing air. Baron Harrington paused, turning his head slightly. He did not see the blow coming. Beatrice had slipped through the chaotic fray, moving with the desperate, silent speed of a woman with nothing left to lose. She launched herself off the stone steps of the lower courtyard, using all her momentum to drive forward. With a primal scream that echoed her brother's bravery 12 years prior, Beatrice drove the silver hunting knife upward, burying the blade directly into the unarmored gap beneath Baron Cedric Harrington's jaw. Harrington's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated shock. He dropped the silver broadsword, his hands desperately clawing at his throat as thick, dark blood erupted from the fatal wound. Beatrice did not let go. She twisted the blade with both hands, staring directly into the eyes of the man who had ruined her family. "That is for the House of Ainsley," Beatrice whispered, her voice colder than the northern winds. Harrington collapsed backward into the snow, dead before his body fully settled. Seeing their leader fall so violently to a woman in a velvet gown, the remaining mercenaries broke rank and fled in sheer terror, rushing back through the shattered gates and abandoning the siege entirely. Beatrice fell to her knees in the blood-soaked snow, her breath coming in ragged, freezing gasps. She looked over at the massive black wolf. Alistair was panting heavily, the silver arrows still lodged in his flesh. Slowly, painfully, the beast began to shrink. Dark fur receded into pale skin. Bones snapped back into their human alignment. Alistair lay naked and shivering in the snow, bleeding profusely from his wounds. Beatrice crawled to him, her hands stained with Harrington's blood. She did not flinch from the sight of him. Without a moment's hesitation, she gripped the shaft of the silver arrow in his shoulder and yanked it out, casting the cursed metal aside. She did the same for his leg. Alistair gasped in pain, his amber eyes fluttering open. He looked up at Beatrice, his gaze sweeping over her blood-spattered face and the fierce, unyielding determination in her eyes. "You saved a monster, Beatrice," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper against the howling wind. Beatrice reached out, her trembling fingers gently tracing the faint, pale scar over his left eye. The hatred was entirely gone, replaced by a fierce, protective devotion that bound their souls together tighter than any blood oath ever could. "I saved my king," Beatrice replied, leaning down to press her forehead against his. "And together we have laid the ghosts of Oakhaven to rest." The storm above Duncraig finally began to break. As the first brilliant rays of morning sunlight pierced through the heavy grey clouds, illuminating the blood and snow of the courtyard, Beatrice wrapped her